Dr. Daniel Amen is a psychiatrist, brain imaging expert, best-selling author, and medical director of the Amen Clinics. He has pioneered the use of brain imaging in clinical psychiatric practice and is a noted expert in the field of the brain and behavior. Dr. Amen's breakthrough research and insights provide hope and more effective treatment for millions of people today.
There are many people who are anxious or depressed or obsessive, prone to anger, they have attentional problems, and they thought their problems were all in their head, purely psychological, if you will. In the research that I've done, what we found is that these and many other problems are brain-based problems, and that when we optimize the brain, their lives become better. We often say, change your brain, change your life, and that's what we've seen.
I was very excited to do this lecture because it's something that most ethicists never think about, which is how your brain works. Now, some poets have thought about it for a long time. Oscar Wilde said the great sins of the world take place in the brain. But it is in the brain that everything takes place. It is in the brain that the poppy is red, that the apple is sweet, that the skylark sings, and I wrote, and that we love and hate each other. So, what does Kip Kinkle's soul look like? Kip, as you know, is a 15-year-old boy in Springfield, Oregon, who was diagnosed with ADD, depression, and dyslexia. He was seeing a psychotherapist. He had been taking psychiatric medicines, but he had an obsession with guns, and one day went to school with multiple weapons, and he got caught and was arrested, and his mom and dad picked him up from jail this night in April 1998. And sometime between 6 o'clock that night and 8 o'clock the next morning, he murdered his mom and dad. First his father came up to him from behind and shot him in the head. Then he waited for his mother to come home, and at 11 o'clock he killed her in the garage. And then 8 o'clock the next morning, he gets in their family station wagon with multiple weapons and gets out of the car in the parking lot and starts shooting people. Shot 22 people, killing 2 more. One of the early school shooters. Based on my work, they scanned him at Oregon Health Sciences University. They did a SPECT scan. And the image on the left, it's a healthy brain, full, even, symmetrical activity. The image on the right is Kip's brain. And what you see is, one, it looks shriveled, something we call toxic exposure. Is very serious damage in the left temporal lobe of the brain, an area that we often associate with violence. And he has decreased activity in the front part of his brain. The part of his brain, as we'll see, is involved in executive function, thinking before you say things, thinking before you do things. It's a little bit different view of morality when you look at it with brain science, because easily people would call him evil. It's very clear he's sick. What he did was evil. There's no question about it. And affects even today the lives of many families, the lives really of a whole community. So let's take something maybe not quite so dramatic. There's another case of a man who came to see me after a suicide attempt. He had a suicide attempt because his wife was leaving him, and the reason she was leaving him was because he was both physically and emotionally abusive. He described himself to me as the anger broker of the Sacramento Valley. And when I first started seeing him, I didn't much like him either. He was nasty, negative, rigid, inflexible. If I was 10 minutes late for an appointment, he would talk about it his whole session. One time I got so irritated, I said, look, I'm the most on-time doctor you'll ever meet in your whole life. So when I go to the doctor, sometimes I wait 2-3 hours. Let it go. But he couldn't let it go. And so I knew I was going to send him over for a scan, because I tend not to treat difficult people unless I can scan them, because I want to get them better as quickly as possible so they don't irritate me that much. And so I sent him over for a scan. And from the scan center, he calls me crying that they did the scan wrong. And it's like, how many scans have you done? None? I mean, because I knew it was just his way of being upset with almost everything. When I saw his scan, one, it gave me empathy. I went, ooh, you know, he's difficult, not because he wants to be difficult, but because there's something abnormal in his brain. And it helped me target treatment for him. And after I got him on the right medicine, continued to do psychotherapy with him, he turned into, no lie, one of the sweetest people that you would ever meet. My staff went from being very tense around him to looking forward to the day he had his appointment. And I found myself over time asking myself this question: who is he really? Is he really this dark, evil, awful person? Or is he really this very kind, sweet man? What does his soul look like? See, I'm becoming to believe that you're really who you are when your brain works right. So, it's a cartoon I just couldn't resist showing you from Real Life Adventures. Psychologist says, well, I think I've identified the psychological source of your aggression, irritability, and deceitfulness. And he goes, yeah, in my opinion, my professional opinion, you're a jerk. Do we do that in psychiatry and psychology and mental health? You bet. We call you antisocial personality disorder. We call you borderline personality disorder. We call you mixed personality disorder. Right? That's our professional way of calling you names. It's time to change. Now, the work at our clinic is based on 9 very simple principles. And I want to go over those because I think it really helps to sort of lead us into an ethical discussion. The first one is that your brain is involved in everything you do. How you think, how you feel, how you act, how well you get along with other people has to do with the moment-by-moment functioning of your brain. The brain even determines the kind of person you are, the kind of doctor that you are, the kind of therapist that you are, the kind of administrative assistant that you are, the kind of university president that you are. It has to do with how your brain works. After looking at what is now 21,000 scans, I mean, it's just very clear. Those doctors that are on time, consistent, predictable, empathic, that can listen, the frontal lobes that work right. Those doctors who you can never find, or they can't be on time, or can't get their reports done, or they're angry and irritable and throw things in the emergency room or in the surgery room. You might have had a frontal lobe injury playing football. So what we often think of as difficult people may in fact have difficult brains. The next principle, and that is when your brain works right, you work right, and when your brain is troubled, you have trouble. These are 2 SPECT scans looking down from the top. Healthy scan on the left, full, even, symmetrical activity, a heroin addict on the right. So do you think the heroin addict has any possibility of being that person they really are inside? It's not possible. Why? Because they don't have full access to the organ that makes them who they are. The third principle is your brain is the most complicated organ in the universe. There is nothing as complicated as the human brain. Nothing. It's estimated we have 100 billion nerve cells, trillions of glial cells or supportive cells. Each nerve cell is connected to other nerve cells by up to 40,000 individual connections between cells, which if you do the math means you have more connections in your brain than there are stars in the universe. Your brain is only 2% of your body's weight, but it uses 20 to 30% of the calories you consume. Right? Your brain's the little heater that's running your life. So if that's true, your brain's involved in everything you do. When it works right, you work right. When it doesn't, there's trouble. It's complicated. This next point is very important, and that is your brain is very soft, about the consistency of soft butter. Some people think of it really like a raw egg, and it's housed in a really hard skull that has ridges. And what that means is that brain injuries, sometimes even brain injuries where you do not lose consciousness, can change your whole life. And nobody knows because virtually nobody looks. If you're difficult, we'll just call you difficult without ever looking at brain function. The next principle, pretty easy, pretty well accepted in the scientific community, and that is certain brain systems are involved in certain behaviors. The prefrontal cortex is executive function. Temporal lobes are involved with auditory processing and memory. Your parietal lobes are involved with direction sense. Occipital lobes involved with vision. Your cerebellum with motor coordination. Now we think also thought coordination. So certain brain systems are involved in certain behaviors, which would then lead you to the next principle, which is problems in specific brain systems tend to cause specific problems. That's not one-to-one, but by and large, if you have damage in your prefrontal cortex, you're not going to supervise yourself very well. You're going to have more problems with impulse control, organization, planning, forethought. Temporal lobes will give you problems with memory, mood stability, temper control. So problems in specific brain systems tend to cause specific problems. The next principle, and this has to do with all different kinds of psychiatric illness, is that psychiatric illnesses are not single or simple disorders. They are complicated. Depression is not one thing. ADD is not one thing. And violence is not one thing. It's many different things. And looking at somebody's brain helps you figure out what their brain looks like, which then leads us to imaging. Imaging the brain helps us be more effective. Why? Because you can actually see what somebody's brain looks like rather than guess, and it increases patient compliance and decreases stigma. It's rampant with psychiatric disorders, and because stigma is rampant with psychiatric disorders, people don't get help. If you have chest pain, you go get help. Why? Because you don't want to die. But if you feel suicidal, sad, blue, racked with anxiety, you don't go. Why? Because you think you can control it. You think it's only the weak that go to the psychiatrist or psychotherapist and get help, and you hurt. So patients who come to us often have been hurting much longer than patients who go to their cardiologist or orthopedic doctor or whoever. Now, the most exciting principle is this last one, and that is your brain can change. With the right interventions, you help optimize brain function. With the wrong interventions, you hurt brain function. But the cool thing is you're not stuck with your brain. If your brain is giving you trouble at school, at work, in your relationships, modern neuroscience says, there's things we can do to help make it better. Well, I think that's very exciting. So in imaging the brain, we do a study called SPECT, which looks at blood flow and activity patterns, and it's based on a lot of information. Now, I think it provides a window into your soul. Now, it doesn't, give you a complete picture of what somebody's soul looks like, but it gives you some clues. And I want to talk about some of those clues today. Normal scan. Christy's grandmother's scan, beautiful, full, even, symmetrical activity. It's a woman that's 82 years old. I mean, just stunning. My mother's scan. This is looking at the hot spots, because in SPECT what we look at are three things. Areas of the brain that work well, areas of the brain that are underactive, areas of the brain that are overactive, and what we see is the back part of the brain, the cerebellum, is the most active part of the brain. So you should see on the outside surface, full, even, symmetrical activity. On these, what we call our active scan, gold, or sometimes it's blue, average. White, most active part of the brain, usually in the back bottom part of the brain or the cerebellum. Now I want to talk about three brain systems and how they apply to ethics and morality. Talk about the prefrontal cortex, the cingulate gyrus, and the temporal lobes. So the prefrontal cortex, as you know, is the executive part of the brain. It's involved in forethought and judgment, impulse control, organization. planning. Now, it's 30% of the human brain, 11% of the chimpanzee brain, 7% of your dog's brain, and I hate to tell you, it's only 3.5% of your cat's brain. They have no forethought. Cats have very little what we would call executive function. Okay, so if we look at the functions of your prefrontal cortex, executive functions like the boss at work. Focus, forethought, impulse control, organization, planning, judgment, empathy, and insight. Let's talk about prefrontal moral strengths. How does this help you in morality? Well, it allows you to focus and match your behaviors to important goals. It's involved in thoughtfulness, sort of control of the inner beast, right? We all have thoughts that no one should ever hear. Isn't that right? I mean, we all have impulses that no one should ever act on. You have a good prefrontal cortex. Think of it like the brake in the brain. It stops you from doing or saying things that really don't fit the goals you have for your life. So if you think of a murderer's brain, if somebody murders on impulse, they didn't wake up that morning and their goal was to hurt somebody. They got a rageful thought and they couldn't control it because their brake was worn, if you will. So control the internal beast. Helps you with judgment, empathy, insight into morality, and maybe more importantly than anything that's heavily involved with maturity is learning from the mistakes that you make so you don't keep making the same mistakes. So prefrontal cortex problems is this cat in the toilet. I call it a Jiminy Cricket deficiency syndrome. Jiminy Cricket from the movie Pinocchio, right? What was Jiminy Cricket? He was his conscience. He helped Pinocchio get his goal. He was assigned by the good fairy to help Pinocchio reach Pinocchio's goal. What was Pinocchio's goal? To be a real boy. And when Jiminy Cricket wasn't there, Pinocchio got himself into all sorts of trouble. So problems, poor internal supervision. They don't watch themselves very well. Internal supervision. Right? Helping you think about what you say before you say it. Help you think about what you do before you do it. The moment is what matters to them. Not 5 moments from now, not 10 moments from now. It's now. I am going to kill those people. And rather than like play it out, which you would do with a good prefrontal cortex, I'm going to kill those people. And then I'm probably going to go to jail. And I don't really like institutional food, and I won't be able to see my wife. These people aren't worth it to me, right? But when your prefrontal cortex doesn't work right, you get the impulse, and you act on it, and then you think about it. They get easily distracted from their goals. I want to be a doctor. 2 weeks later, no, I don't really want to study. I want to go to Coco's and have French fries. It's they get off track very easily and poor control of their impulses. I'll get to it later. They don't do things in a timely way. They lack empathy and insight. So they don't think about how their behavior is going to impact others. They don't learn from their mistakes. They have low anxiety. Is anxiety helpful? Sure, it's helpful. It's why you don't drive at 150 miles an hour down the freeway. It's because you go, if I do that, I could be hurt. Right? It actually found that people with antisocial personality disorder have low levels of anxiety. They have low sweat gland activity in response to stress and low heart rate levels. Consequences don't matter as much as would be helpful for them. And there's this whole notion of sin. Sin, I guess there are many different definitions of sin, but sin is, in my way of thinking, doing something that you know is wrong. And when you have low activity in your prefrontal cortex, you don't supervise that very well, and you end up in confession a lot more than if your prefrontal cortex was working right. You end up more at the altar for doing stupid things than if your prefrontal cortex had been working right. Okay. So with prefrontal cortex, gives you bad habits. They smoke more. They're trying to stimulate it in one way or another. All right. ADD, people who have ADD get into trouble more than other people. Why? Because they say things that they shouldn't say, or they do things that they shouldn't do. 75% of people with ADD have interpersonal problems because they say stupid things that hurt other people's feelings. They also go to jail more often. 43% of untreated aggressive hyperactive boys will be arrested for a felony by the time they're 16. In one study done at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, one of the largest prisons in California, they did a study of 175 consecutive new admissions to the prison. 75% of them had childhood histories of hyperactivity or learning disability. And what we see in the ADD brain is that when they try to concentrate, they get overall decreased activity in the brain, which means they have less access to their supervisor. Less access, if you will. I mean, think of the prefrontal cortex like the superego. You know, if you know Freud's superego, ego, and id, the id is a low prefrontal cortex state. A good prefrontal cortex state is the ego, sort of your adult. The superego is that person who's beating you up for doing bad things, and that's often when the prefrontal cortex works too hard. The cool thing is you can treat ADD. You can actually optimize brain function, and they become more thoughtful. They become more predictable, more ethical, more moral in their behavior. What we see in antisocial personality disorder is often pretty severe damage to the prefrontal cortex. Adrian Raine, in his study of antisocial personality disorder, found that people with that disorder actually had 11% less volume, 11% less cells in their prefrontal cortex. It's a completely new way to start looking at people who do bad things. And a lot of people are sort of bucking that. It's like, oh no, we all have full responsibility. Wish that it was so. It is just not. Your behavior is related to how your brain works. How about the cingulate gyrus? Well, the cingulate gyrus runs down the middle of the prefrontal cortex. It's involved with cognitive flexibility. It's involved with being able to shift your attention, being able to go from thought to thought, move from idea to idea, be flexible, go with the flow. Helps you see options. Cooperate, get outside of yourself and into somebody else. Now, when there are cingulate problems, when the cingulate gyrus works too hard, people get stuck on things. Actually, this is the image of someone's belly. And this is, you might have seen this in the paper. This was a man who had a compulsion to swallow money. And he went to the doctor feeling sort of queasy, and his family said, we don't let him be around change because he swallows change. And he had actually swallowed over $300 worth of change and ended up dying. I guess this was his way of trying to take it with him. But when we see hyperactivity in the cingulate gyrus, people get stuck on things. They're rigid, inflexible. They have to have things their way. So on the surface, they actually appear selfish. They worry. They predict and operate out of fear. They hold grudges. What's a grudge? Get a bad thought about somebody and you can't let it go. Think that'll give you moral problems? Just think about what's going on in the Middle East, in Brain in the News, the column I write every week. A couple of weeks ago I wrote about the Middle East. When people are traumatized repeatedly, on both sides this is true, when they're traumatized repeatedly, it fires up their emotional brain, including their cingulate gyrus. And they can't stop thinking about it. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. And they will justify the murders that they do of other human beings because, well, you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you. They obsess. We've seen it in the stalkers that we have scanned. They have compulsions. Addictions, like sexual addictions, gambling, addictions, drug addiction. And you know them when you meet them, is that they're oppositional and argumentative. No matter what it is you say to them, they argue with you. I mean, you can say 10 innocuous things to them, they argue with 8. So this is a girl who was having early problems with alcohol. The cingulate gyrus is what's running down the middle of her brain, just on fire. You wouldn't know why does she drink? To settle it down. And of course you know about road rage in Southern California. Famous for road rage. Right? Well, this actually happened in Northern California. It's an orthopedic surgeon who used to chase people. And, somebody accidentally cuts me off on the freeway. I think to myself, you idiot. And then I leave it alone. Why? There's seriously crazy people out there. Right? Who needs to engage? Who needs the trouble? These people, like this guy, somebody cuts him off, and he gets the thought in his head, you idiot, and then he can't get rid of it. You idiot, you idiot, you idiot, you idiot, you idiot. And then he chases them as a way to get the thought out of his head. It's not helpful. All right. Last brain system to talk about is the temporal lobes underneath your temples, behind your eyes. They're involved with very important human functions like language and memory, mood stability, temper control, listening, reading, and reading social cues. They're also involved with rhythm, music, spiritual experience. We talked about where people might perceive spiritual experience, the right temporal lobe. And a new study that's involved with insight. You know when you get that idea in your head, it's just like it all like opens up, like you get an aha experience, right? That many religious people get, and you just know it. It's a right lateral temporal lobe phenomenon. Brand new study out just last week. When you get that you know sort of feeling. So, I often wonder if people who are very religious have a lot of activity in their right temporal lobe, and people who are atheists have not much going on in their temporal lobe. Sort of an interesting dialogue that we're going to look at in a study that we're going to do. All right. Moral problems. I guess, let's see. Though Dr. Zapata was a talented proctologist, his dyslexia occasionally proved problematic. I'm sorry, but I had to do it. When we see problems in the temporal lobes, there's often issues with temper and aggression. Kip Kinkle, left temporal lobe problem. Many of our guys that do really bad things, left temporal lobe problems. The aggression can be external, going to hurt you, or it can be internal. I'm going to hurt myself. Emotionally unstable. Their moods bounce around. They often have memory and learning problems, and may have spiritual problems. I had one schizophrenic patient who had horrible hyperactivity in his left temporal lobe. He felt bombarded by the devil on a regular basis, almost to the point where he was feeling possessed. I put him on an anticonvulsant, Depakote. The devil went away. And he could get back to going to church and not feeling tormented. And religiosity, or feeling intensely religious, has been found to be more common in people who have temporal lobe epilepsy. The temporal lobes are clearly involved with God. Andrew is a very special case. 9 years old when we first scanned him. We scanned him because he attacked a little girl on the baseball field for no particular reason. He happens to be my nephew and my godson. My sister-in-law called me up and I'm like, excuse me. And when I saw him in my office the next day, they drove 8 hours to see me. They said, what's going on? And I had no history of trouble. No one was teasing him, hurting him, upsetting him, and I knew his mom and dad. They're like really great people. So my first thought is scan him. My second thought, because a lot of colleagues have criticized my work, was, well, maybe this is a family problem. And if you have good psychoanalytic training, you can find dirt in anybody's family. Is that not true? As you've sort of gone through your psychopathology classes and looked at why people do what they do, if you never look at it from the lens of brain science, you will come up with all sorts of interesting psychological theories that may or may not have anything to do with reality. So, my first thought was scan him, and then I start playing this psychodynamic game in my head, and then I went, stop it! Scan him. If he scans normal, then you can figure out psychodynamically what the issue is. And when we scanned him, this picture came up. He had a cyst the size of a golf ball occupying the space of his left temporal lobe. And I couldn't get anybody to take it seriously to take it out. His doctor here talked to 3 pediatric neurologists. All of them said they wouldn't touch the cyst, didn't think it was related to his behavior, at which point I'm nearly psychotic. And I finally called Jorge Lazareff, who's the pediatric neurosurgeon at UCLA, and I told him about Andrew. He said, oh, Dr. Amen, I have 3 other children with left temporal lobe cysts who are all aggressive. Do you think that has anything to do with it? Maybe. Please take it out, which they did. And when he woke up from surgery, he smiled at his mother. He hadn't smiled at her for a year. And the bad thoughts went away. And it's not been easy. He's had, with cysts, they have to put shunts in, and he's had the surgery revised a number of times. But if you look at him now at the age of 18, he's sweet. He's a loving, consistent, predictable young man. So you're sort of happy to be around. If we wouldn't have figured this out, where would he be? He'd either be dead or he'd be in jail. And how would his mother feel about herself? She would feel like there's something she did that was wrong. And isn't that unfair? Another case of a boy who had a cerebellar tumor that was taken out when he was 3 years old, and then subsequent to the surgery he developed meningitis and then developed temporal lobe epilepsy. And what they missed, they've been treating his temporal lobe epilepsy for 14 years, is that he had the cingulate gyrus from hell. So he has obsessive compulsive disorder. Actually, he has to have things his way. Now, from a moral standpoint, we could say he's selfish. When you look at a cingulate gyrus, you go, oh my God, it's like he has seizures in that part of his brain. And one morning, he had to have pancakes for breakfast in the morning. His mother didn't have any. He grabbed a knife and chased her around the house for 45 minutes because she didn't have pancakes. That's not rational behavior. Now, people would say that's goal-directed behavior, right? So if you go into a court of law, people would say, well, he's got great frontal lobes. He's got goal-directed behavior. It's like sick behavior. What's the goal? He loves his mother. He got stuck. He got a bad thought in his head, like we all do, but he couldn't supervise the bad thought because his frontal lobe, especially his cingulate gyrus, was on fire. So, why? Why do things like Columbine happen? My book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, came out 2 months before Columbine happened. And so the editor at Newsweek, Sharon Begley, called me on the phone and she goes, why does that happen? And they published in Newsweek 4 of my images about a case I was working on in San Francisco called the Red Sweater case. Why it's called the Red Sweater case? Dylan Katz, 16-year-old boy, was walking his dog across the street, and he had a red sweater on. 2 boys from Healdsburg saw him. They were in a car with a bunch of sort of wannabe gang members, and they saw him. They were all drunk. They got out of the car and confronted him and go, what color do you claim? And Dylan said, I don't claim any color. And Jose said, wrong answer, and beat him nearly to death. In fact, they had to drag him off this boy. You go, what's that about? Because these boys claim the color red. There was no reason, even from a gang perspective, to fight. And so they charged Jose and his friend with attempted murder. Huge case in the Bay Area. And Joe Stogner, who was Jose's defense attorney, sent him for neuropsych testing to a neuropsychologist. And the neuropsychologist said, this kid's got frontal lobe problems. He's got executive problems. Send him to Dr. Amen to get a scan. And so I sent him to me. And I had no clue that this was like an important case in the media. Because, you know, you have a violent teenager, you bet I want to scan him. Find out what's going on, because this could be helpful for him. And when we scanned Jose's brain, it was extraordinarily abnormal. So healthy on the left, Jose's brain on the right, terrible temporal lobes and frontal lobes. And then if you look at his cingulate gyrus, he had the cingulate gyrus from hell. He had this triad I've been writing about for a number of years on violence. Low temporal lobes that give you dark, evil, awful thoughts. A cingulate gyrus where you can't stop thinking about the bad thoughts. And no frontal lobes where you can't supervise the bad thoughts that you're stuck on. But then I met Jose. And I met his father. And I learned about Jose's story. Because on the surface, you would just say he's an evil, bad person. Right? Well, the fact is he wasn't named for a month because his father was in jail. And they waited for Dad to get out of jail before they named him. Jose's first memory of his dad throwing a brick through a plate glass window at their house. He had a very violent relationship with Jose's mother. They got divorced when Jose was 6. And when Jose was 8 years old, his mother was murdered. And they never found the killer. But Jose told me, with tears coming down his face, that the night he found out his mother was murdered, he cried and couldn't stop crying. And his father came to him that night and said, if you pray to God and you stop crying, your mother will be here in the morning. Imagine with me what that would do to the psyche of an 8-year-old boy. In addition, he had 4 brain injuries. And got involved in early drug abuse. He said, it made me feel less depressed. It made me feel more social. I mean, it was clearly self-medication for an underlying depression that he had. And so what I did is I took Jose's pictures into court with all these photographers and camera people and all of that. And I told his story. And rather than being convicted of attempted murder, he got convicted of aggravated assault, which was a significantly lesser crime. And I got hate mail from people using high technology to excuse bad behavior. To me, it just made sense. You know, he's somebody that's sick. Now, he went to jail for 11 years, right? I mean, that sort of honors the idea of responsibility. But he went to a place where he could get help. Because, you know, most people who go to jail come home. And if you don't identify the problems that they have, they're more likely to go back. Recidivism in our country is 69%, or thereabouts. So, does the imaging work? Does neuroscience have a place in violence? Well, there are treatment implications. Brain systems can change, can be optimized. We talked about that. So treating the brain might mitigate violence. You might be less violent if we can treat you more effectively. Teaches us, we always treat temporal lobe problems before we do anything else. There's a study from Stanford where they studied juvenile offenders. And they found that they gave a subset of them Depakote. And when you took an anticonvulsant, Depakote, they were dramatically less aggressive. But you know what happened? This study made the front page of the Los Angeles Times. Not as a really cool, important finding, which it is, but they're doing research on juveniles in jail. And so Gray Davis, in his infinite wisdom, pulled the study and said, well, no, we're not going to do that. Because he was looking for what was politically correct, rather than what's the right thing. You bet we should study these people. Now, because there were research abuses in the 60s in jail, they like completely pulled research. Well, how stupid is that? These are people you should be studying to try to understand and prevent violence. Should brain imaging science be used in court? That's really controversial. Well, I think it should, because it helps you understand the link between brain function and behavior. How else are juries going to understand that information? If you want to give somebody a fair defense, how can you not talk about the brain? It gives additional information to clinical and paper and pencil testing, like neuropsych testing. Helps juries understand difficult behaviors and can be involved in sentence mitigation. I think you have to look at what you do, because then you can treat brain system pathology. Now, it's not always helpful. I think you have to be thoughtful and careful on how you use it. And people can overstate what they see. So, I mean, we have to be cautious. Scans cannot make a diagnosis. They're not a doctor in a box. It can't tell if somebody's guilty or innocent. It can't tell you why somebody did something. And it can't date a brain trauma or toxic exposure. Although if you have somebody who's healthy and functioning, and then you have a car accident, and then you have somebody that's not healthy and functioning, you know, you can sort of deduce that the accident had something to do with it. Oh, Dr. Amen isn't experimental. I hear that in court all the time when I go. And I go, well, it's covered by Medicare. Medicare does not cover experimental procedures. And the Society of Nuclear Medicine has 4 indications for SPECT: brain trauma, dementia, pre-surgical evaluation of epilepsy, and stroke. Now, based on our work with 21,000 scans, we've added indications that we do it for, like violence, like resistant psychiatric conditions, suicide, subtyping psychiatric disorders, and so on. Controversial in court? You bet. Some say it's not ready. There are a couple of caution articles about it. There's a whole group of people who go, too many things can change the scan. But that's absolutely true of any other imaging study or medical study or neuropsychological study. You have to do it right. And you have to do it consistently, and you have to do it with thought. I would say, how do you know? Unless you look. All right. Are there future implications? You bet. If you include neuroscience into morality and ethics, it teaches you have to protect and nurture the brain. Now, we need, as a society, to love, honor, and respect the brain now, early. We need to teach brain science in school. Children need to know their brain matters. You really want to impact drug abuse, talk to them about brain science, and then show them what drugs do to the brains. If you just show them the poster without teaching them about neuroscience, they won't get it. That means we have to fund brain research. Juvenile justice screening, you bet. Kids who do bad things, they should be screened for psychiatric illnesses because they're rampant. Do neuropsychiatric evaluations on all first-strike offenders. You know, California is a 3-strike state. Commit 3 felonies. Not all violent felonies. Commit 3 felonies. You can be in jail for the rest of your life. At a cost of about $500,000 to the California taxpayers. I was involved in a case in Santa Barbara where they did something called a Kelly Fry hearing. You know, should we let the imaging into court or not? And they said yes. This is this guy's 3rd offense. He went to Bonds and he stole $11 worth of material. That was his 3rd strike. I'm like, you're kidding. No, that was his 3rd strike. I think we should do prison screening and better treatment of offenders. When my book, Healing the Hardware of the Soul, came out, a psychiatrist from Berkeley sent me a nice letter thanking me for writing it. And on the back of the envelope, he wrote this: all truth goes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is vehemently denied. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. And we're between 2 and 3. Some of you have heard me say, you know, it's sometimes not fun bleeding on the cutting edge. Right? But it's in many ways my faith that keeps me going. Because I believe that this is really helpful. And when you apply this to the death penalty, you begin to get real concerns about the death penalty. Would Jesus kill sick people? I don't even think he'd kill non-sick people. But would he kill sick people? Ethical considerations. Oh, come on, Dr. Amen. Aren't you using the brain as an excuse? People ask me that. I go, well, it's time to move beyond Descartes in the 17th century. Right? He separated the mind from the brain, and he was wrong. The mind and the brain are intertwined. They are not separate. So what to do? Neuropsychiatric evaluations on people who do bad things, or people who feel bad. Now, clearly, there's so much to learn. This is the most exciting time, I think, in the history of mental health. It's the most exciting time because you're going to see an explosion of research and new clinical tools and new medicines and new forms of psychotherapy to help balance the brain. So clearly we have a lot to do. But I just don't think it's conscionable to keep brain science out of courts and out of our conscious minds. So, new directions, evaluate people who do bad things. You know, there's this judge in Seattle, Washington. His name is David Admire. He adopted 2 of his children. And his 2 kids had ADD and learning disabilities. And what he noticed was a lot of people who were coming into his courtroom reminded him of his kids. And so he got together with the Learning Disability Association of Washington. They came up with a screening tool. And everybody who gets convicted of a crime in his court automatically gets screened for ADD and learning disabilities. Isn't that a cool idea? And if you show a positive on the screening, you are court-ordered to a 14-week course to learn about what you have. Wow. Now, they've tracked these people for 12 years. Recidivism in that county is 69%. People who go through the course, their recidivism, commit a crime, likely you're going to commit another one, 29%. For every dollar they spend on the program, they save the state 7. Is that cool or what? Right? I mean, we're in a budget crisis. So is more treatment more expensive? No, it's less expensive if you do it in the right way. Rethink past hurts. That's what brain science teaches you. It teaches you to forgive yourself. Have an open mind. Be excited about the future. And be really careful when judging other people. Judge not, lest you be judged.